I'm Danny Roddy of DannyRoddy.com, and today I'm talking with Georgi, aka Haidut of RayPeatForum.com. Georgi is an independent health researcher and the owner of IdeaLabsDC.com, a small company producing high-quality boutique supplements with the focus of supporting a healthy metabolism. Today, Georgi and I will discuss digestion and mood from a bioenergetic point of view, or the interaction between an organism and its environment and how those changes influence cellular respiration. In addition to thanking Georgi for talking with me today, I'd like to thank my patrons for making this show and all the content I make possible. You can become a patron by going to patreon.com/DannyRoddy. Without further ado, here's the show. I was thinking that we would tie like nitric oxide into this episode. That is strongly involved in digestive problems, correct?
Yes, that's true. Yeah, actually one of the primary causes of them.
And I understand little about it, but it's really interesting to me. And I think it's confusing based on like the emails I receive and the general reading of even how Ray talks about it, of like, okay, so how does it become like out of control? But before we get into that, and we can dive into that at any time, I thought we'd start a little bit slower and talk about your experiences with digestion, moving from moving from like a zero carb to a Ray Peat inspired diet was just horrendous. And I always feel for people that are transitioning over because my digestion of milk was just the worst. It can be really confusing, especially when your body is giving you all these signals and then you're trying to do something new.
Yeah.
So I thought that'd be a good starting place.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, basically for me, it all started. I would say I've always been interested in nutrition and healthy living, so to speak. Even though I ended up damaging myself initially, because I was an athlete in college, and also I come from a country where basically the dogma was that they did not believe in genetics. So in other words, they practiced, they believed in the Pavlov Principle that your closest interaction with the environment and the world around you is through the food that you eat. So basically, you are what you eat. And if you eat bad stuff, you become bad communist, right? So I wanted to be a good communist, so I paid close attention to what they were teaching in school. And some of the stuff was actually pretty good. So I became interested in nutrition because if that's the primary way through which you react to the environment, interact with the environment, clearly plays a big role in your life in general. I think many people realize that after they lose their health, how important it is and how it affects every aspect of their life. So, after I was an athlete in college, so I was interested, that naturally got me interested into endurance sports after college. I was on the crew team when I was in college. So that's a kind of a very grueling endurance type of sport. Yeah. So after I graduated, everybody told me you need to stay in shape, and one of the best ways to do it is continue what you've been doing. Well, I didn't have time, neither the desire to keep getting up at like 5 a.m. in the morning to go row in freezing cold rain. So I picked the next best thing that I thought, and it was long distance running. And long distance running and the paleo world are really like best buddies. And I think it's easy to understand why. It's the main premise of the endurance sport is that you can only do it if you become a fat burner. Clearly, if you run for 26 miles, you're not going to have enough glycogen to sustain you. And even if you do, at some point you'll start producing a lot of lactic acid. So the body adaptively does turn to burning fat after a certain amount of endurance exercise.
But Georgi, lactic acid is a useful fuel.
Oh, no, really? Yeah, but it's only in emergency situations. Even people in the ER will tell you that. I had a friend of mine ended up in ER, and we talked to the doctor who observed him, and basically one of the first things they did was measure lactic acid, and they gave the person some intravenous thiamine. And I asked why, and the doctor said, well, as a stress reaction, thiamine rises in the blood, and the brain and the liver can use it in emergency situations to produce glucose from lactate, right? But he says if this continues for too long, it starts to poison you. It causes hypoxia, and we don't want that. So we're trying to get the person out of the shock state. So we gave them something that lowered lactate. So right then and there, I knew. Ray, the whole premise of Ray, at least, is when it comes to shock states, is correct. But back to fat burning, basically, since I started running long distances, I would say anywhere between 6 and 8 miles, 5 to 6 times a week. Some of my running buddies, introduced me to the paleo world. I went to some meetings. Quite a few people here in DC that were into the paleo diet. So it seemed very natural. And initially, to be honest, I felt really good almost too good, which should have been a warning sign, but I was too stupid at the time. Like Mike Tyson used to say, you get old too soon and smart too late. Hopefully that's not the case for me. So between 2008 and 2009, I was very much into running, very much into low carb, and happily burning my fat. And then one day at the beginning of 2009, I crashed completely. I woke up one morning, I couldn't move. Basically, I had a lot of muscle pain, dizziness, disorientation, weakness, pretty scary neurological symptoms. So I went to the doctor. They were concerned that I have some kind of neurological condition, sent me to get a lot of imaging. Thankfully, I avoided the x-rays, which were the first recommended step. I did only MRIs and ultrasounds. But basically, they said nothing is structurally wrong with you. So basically, keep doing what you're doing. So I tried to keep doing what I was doing for about another month. And then I got such a bad flu that I spent 2 weeks in bed. I think Ray had a similar episode in his younger years. So something wasn't working. That was basically, I realized that whatever I was doing, it wasn't working. I started researching a little bit what could be causing my symptoms. I think it was through Reddit. I found a post by a person who had very similar symptoms to me, and he suggested that I do some tests for estrogen, for prolactin, for cortisol, for things like that. And some of them came back elevated, especially the prolactin part. Prolactin, cortisol was borderline, prolactin was high, and estrogen was borderline high as well. So I started Googling, what could be causing these things, and I just happened to type estrogen, prolactin, cortisol, neurological conditions, and then Ray's article popped up. That's how I found him. It was through almost the serendipity, so to speak. So I found his website, and just the very, very first article, it immediately clicked.
When did you become interested in IBS, constipation, diarrhea, Crohn's, etc.?
I was interested even back then because while I was having the neurological issues, I was also having digestive issues, but nobody paid enough attention to them. I was told that, this is probably because you're stressed, you have anxiety, and you probably have depression, and that's what's causing these digestive issues. And I laughed the first time I heard this, even though I didn't know back then that it's complete BS. It just sounded so ridiculous. How can these things be completely unrelated? I mean, it seemed that all of my neurological symptoms, they always coincided with the digestive ones. Yet no doctor that I spoke to wanted or was willing to make the connection.
That's funny you mentioned that. Like 2 or 3 people have pointed out that they'll have a bowel movement and then whatever problem they were experiencing would just completely disappear. And I've always thought that observation was extremely interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me because after the food turns into fecal matter, you really have no use of it. So the sooner you expel it, the better. In other words, the faster your digestion, minus diarrhea, of course, short of diarrhea, the better your health will probably be, because after you've extracted whatever can be extracted from that food, the more it lingers inside you, and we're going to talk about this later, I'm guessing, the longer it lingers inside you, the more it poisons you through various mediators that it helps create, like nitric oxide, endotoxin, serotonin, prolactin, estrogen, the prostaglandins as well. So really, waste should be treated as waste and expelled as soon as possible.
And what are some of the common treatments when you go to like a conventional doctor for those problems?
If you do some research on digestive issues, they'll try to group them into several large categories. So I guess modern medicine tries to split things into structural and functional diseases. So the first thing they'll do is they'll try to rule out a structural cause, such as if you have a tumor, or there's a perforation in the intestines, or there's something else nefarious going on that could be causing these things. So the first thing they do is they'll usually send you for some sort of an imaging session. Usually, actually, almost all of them first start with ionizing radiation. And for some reason, they strongly resist sending you for an abdominal MRI. Maybe it's because of price, but the first thing they'll do is they'll do imaging. If that fails, then they will probably try to coax you into doing some kind of a scoping session, such as an endoscopy if you have a stomach issue further closer to the rib cage, or colonoscopy if your complaints are further down closer to the pelvis. All of these things. Sometimes they will even suggest biopsy, and even if that fails, I have friends who have been suggested and agreed to a laparoscopy imaging. In other words, they'll cut your belly open and sticking camera in there and try to look at things if everything else fails. Yeah, that's really part of the diagnosis. It's surgery as part of the diagnostic procedure. It's really amazing. And if everything else fails, in other words, if all the diagnostic attempts to diagnose a structural cause fail, then they'll either tell you have a functional problem, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, or you have a mental problem. And then they'll either refer you to a psychiatrist, or if it's a functional problem, they'll basically tell you that that there's nothing that they can do. And up until recently, now I think now they have a drug for IBS, which happens to be a synthetic type of endotoxin, believe it or not. And then basically, if you have a functional disease, they'll tell you there isn't much that they can do. So the several main classes are the inflammatory bowel diseases, which include things like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and some people have a chronic gastritis is probably there too. Even though modern medicine hasn't made up its mind whether you can have autoimmune gastritis or it's just chronic gastritis. So those are the inflammatory, and they're thought to be autoimmune diseases of unknown etiology and unknown origin. Basically, they don't know they claim that they don't know what's causing them. And on the other spectrum, the functional diseases are mostly called IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and they're classified into two main types: diarrhea predominant and constipation predominant. So if you have a digestive issue and you go to a GI doctor and you don't have a tumor or some other kind of a structural damage that can be seen on an imaging study, you will likely be lumped into one of these categories.
So I suspect that the poor treatment from the traditional methods motivates a lot of people to look into diet, because when I was hanging out with the paleo people, they positioned themselves as digestive experts, and everything was related to the gut. So they would talk about probiotics, fermented foods, how important it was to avoid sugar, specifically because fructose malabsorption. And it seemed like if Ray's focus is on thyroid and energy metabolism, it seemed like the low carbs focus was on the intestine, but minus a lot of context for how that was working.
Yeah, I think that because I've talked to some sort of alternative approach people, alternative medicine, naturopathic medicine, especially the ones that recommend the probiotic and fermented food approach. So here's the thing: both modern medicine and the alternative, so-called alternative approach, they don't believe that structure and function are interdependent at every level. For many of these people, it's all about structure, and if there's a change in structure, it must be either genetic, or there was some kind of a trauma, or there was some kind of an external, almost like a force that made it happen. And almost none of the people that I've talked to, especially medical professionals, are willing to consider the idea that chronic decline in function can actually cause structural changes. This is starting to change recently. I think there was a study that came out at the beginning of 2015 that now admits that functional decline precedes structural changes in people with depression, and now they recognize that inflammation plays a very large role into various depressive type of disorders. So basically, if you believe that structure is the only thing that can cause problems, and you don't know what the reasons could be, you can set up a regimen that doesn't really correspond well to human physiology. It's not a bad thing to consider that a lot of health problems can start in the gut, but if you're going to treat things starting at the gut, then you need to know a little bit about cell physiology and how the gut works and what is likely to work and what isn't. And for example, the prebiotics or they even now they recommend probiotics. So basically, they're saying, well, your digestive issues are probably due to the fact that the bacteria in your colon is pathological. You have the wrong type of bacteria. So if you take these pills or you eat this yogurt, which costs $20 for a little packet, all your problems will disappear. Okay, a couple of things that are wrong with that. First of all, as far as I know, to this day, it has not been shown that ingesting probiotic foods with probiotic or probiotic pills will get to your colon unless you take a special formulation, and most of these are pharmaceutical drugs. So if you're buying probiotics from the local grocery store, at best they'll be ineffective. But lately, and I actually looked at some research, and it seems to be going back to the 1940s, people noticed that the patients who have a high number of the Lactobacillus species bacteria in their colon, they tend to have an abnormal rate of autoimmune conditions, especially lupus. I think that the correlation is also strong for multiple sclerosis, for rheumatoid arthritis. So basically, lactic acid producing bacteria, it's probably not good for you. I started the show by explaining that the ER doctor told us that lactic acid is a source of emergency fuel, but if it's allowed to persist in your system for too long, it becomes highly pathogenic, leads to hypoxia, and hypoxia ultimately leads to cancer. So why would you want to ingest food that makes you produce more lactic acid? I just don't understand the rationale. I think that should tell you that you should seriously question at least the prebiotic and the probiotic approach. As far as fermented foods, they also directly provide lactic acid. That's the process of fermentation in foods as well as in the cancer cells. So you're providing direct lactic acid to your system, and if you're in compromised state, it can put you into a shock state pretty quickly. On top of that, fermented foods are mutagenic and they're directly carcinogenic. Japan and portions of South Korea that have the highest consumption of fermented foods per capita in the world also have the highest incidence of stomach cancer. Now, of course, correlation doesn't prove causality, but given the mechanism and the physiology behind how these foods and bacteria and supplemental probiotics work, I don't think it is likely for them to work at best. And at worst, knowing how the cell handles lactic acid and various mutagens from the environment, you may be increasing your risk for cancer. So I think the approach is based on a misunderstanding of how cell physiology works.
And the alternative tends to believe that serotonin is something you do want to increase. And I don't know too many people, at least like high profile, low carb celebrity people, who haven't suggested or sell things like 5-HTP or L-tryptophan, and just that point of view, not understanding the role of serotonin in digestion and cellular physiology, and that could have a disastrous consequence.
I agree, and I have actually challenged some people to explain why are they taking 5-HTP or even SSRIs, which are actually commonly prescribed for digestive disorders, believe it or not. So I've questioned both doctors and members of the alternative circle to explain why. And usually the answer is, well, serotonin promotes gut motility, and if you have a constipation or any kind of a digestive issue, that it will make you get rid of the waste faster. I guess that's one way to look at it. Just keep in mind, yes, one of serotonin's physiological functions is to increase intestinal contraction. In other words, to stimulate bowel movements. However, in excess, and many of these digestive disorders are characterized by excess of serotonin. In excess, serotonin is the primary cause of fibrosis. So if you have a condition like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, perhaps the worst thing you can do is take a serotonin precursor like tryptophan or an SSRI drug like Prozac, Lexapro, and other members of the SSRI drug class, and they will increase the availability of serotonin both in your brain and in your gut. 90% of your serotonin is produced in the gut, and the amount that is produced, if it's physiological, you don't want to mess with it. You don't want to increase it anymore. First, at best, it's going to give you diarrhea. At worst, it will cause fibrosis in your digestive tract, and that's pretty much what advanced stages of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are. Basically, they get so much fibrosis that the only treatment that they can suggest and really works at this stage is surgical removal of the entire colon and wearing colostomy bag for the rest of your life.
So focusing on the metabolism or bioenergetics would be a good way of at least going about testing and then experimenting with things like nutrition, supplements, and pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, and I'll start with explaining at least my understanding of the bioenergetic view and how it applies to the digestive issues. So basically, when your metabolism is not working well, that has a systemic effect. It's everywhere. So you have to start with a premise. You have to understand that the premise of modern medicine, that things are isolated and never affect each other, is just wrong. Most people that show up with an isolated disease have systemic symptoms. To just brush them aside and say they're unrelated, they're non-specific, it doesn't do anybody any good. I mean, at the very least, the person has symptoms and medicine should be doing something to treat them. And the correct thing is to look at what's causing these symptoms. And if they're systemic, assume, in the lack of other evidence, that the specific disease is probably just a specific manifestation of a systemic disease. So in other words, if your metabolism is not working, if the cell is not properly energized, it swells and absorbs water from its surroundings. The potassium and magnesium in the cell they're intracellular minerals, and they basically, most of them stay in the cell. And when the cell absorbs water, it flushes out potassium and magnesium and absorbs calcium and sodium. And sometimes this is physiological and it's needed because the muscle needs to contract, and the muscles also in your gastrointestinal tract, and they need to contract. So calcium is what's responsible for the contraction of muscles. So you do need that in certain states. However, in low energetic states, the cell will have problem returning to its resting state. In other words, when the cell is excited, it absorbs water, loses potassium and magnesium, absorbs sodium and calcium. And when the event which triggered the cell excitation is over, in a properly energized person with well-working metabolism, the cell will return to its resting state, will reabsorb potassium, magnesium, and expel sodium and calcium. Now, this whole process of absorption and expelling of water, that's especially true for the cells in the colon and even the small intestine, because the very function of the colon is to remove water from the fecal material and make it solid. So in people that don't have colon, they have a state of almost chronic diarrhea because they're missing that part of the digestive tract which turns the food waste into an actual solid fecal matter. So basically, the purpose of the colon, its very purpose, is to remove water and and make the stool hard. So in a hypothyroid person, the colon is chronically swollen, as we described, because of the absorbed water. And if this is maintained chronically, it contributes to inflammation because any swelling and absorption of water will tend to increase estrogen. Water buildup anywhere will tend to increase estrogen, endotoxin, and serotonin. These things will also on their own increase the synthesis of nitric oxide and prolactin.
And when the cells are swollen and they're losing potassium and magnesium and taking up calcium, they're producing lactic acid, increasing the liberation of the free fatty acids and lowering the carbon dioxide.
That's correct. Yeah, basically, if the cell is in an excited state, if it has proper energetic reserves, it can handle that state, and once the exciting event is over, it will return to its resting state. But if the exciting event continues for too long, or the person does not have proper energetic reserves, or both, eventually the cell will not have the ability to return to its resting state. So it will be stuck into that inefficient metabolism, which is common not just in cancer cells. I think medicine is starting to realize that the overproduction, the so-called wasting of glucose, the overproduction of lactic acid from glucose is increased in virtually all chronic degenerative conditions. In fact, it has been even found in people with the flu. I know of people who have gone to the ER due to flu symptoms, and as part of their hydration protocol, they're always given thiamine. And one of the rationale is that thiamine will lower the lactate and it will make their symptoms of malaise go away. Lactic acid is what causes generally these symptoms of malaise.
Is that because the thiamine, the pyruvate dehydrogenase, that's a cofactor for that?
Yes, that's actually a very good point. So maybe it's good to explain at a high level how the whole metabolism thing works, because I think some people are confused. Is the glycolysis good? Is it bad? What should be inhibited? What should be enhanced? So you can basically divide metabolism into three main categories: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. The first step is always glycolysis. Without glycolysis, your cells will not be able to work. That's what basically you take glucose, and the end product of glycolysis is pyruvate. There are two things that can happen to pyruvate afterwards. If the enzymes pyruvate dehydrogenase, which is a thiamine-dependent enzyme, and the enzyme pyruvate carboxylase, which is a biotin and manganese-dependent enzyme, if these two enzymes are working, they will pick up pyruvate and they'll convert it to acyl-CoA, which is the entry point to the Krebs cycle. Now, Krebs cycle works without oxygen, so basically it does not really have an opportunity to produce lactic acid. But if one of these or both enzymes are not working for various reasons, and they're shown to not work, especially in cancer cells, but in other sick cells as well, pyruvate will build up. The end product of glycolysis is pyruvate and the reduced coenzyme called NADH. During the process of glycolysis, pyruvate is produced, glucose and NAD are consumed, and NADH is also produced. Now, the body needs NAD to continue the metabolism. So after glycolysis, the buildup of pyruvate in NADH, if it continues for too long, the body will say, I need my NAD back. And the way it gets it is either from external precursors like niacinamide, or by recycling NADH back to NAD. And the way this happens is, how do you recycle a reduced substance back into its oxidized form? You oxidize it. And in the absence of oxygen, which is what the anaerobic glycolysis does, pyruvate is the oxidizing agent. So what happens is, the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase takes pyruvate and NADH and converts them into lactate and NAD. So that's really basically, if your Krebs cycle enzymes, the entry to them is not working, you'll be stuck in glycolysis. And if it continues for too long with a buildup of pyruvate and NADH, the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase will convert the excess pyruvate to lactate. And that's being seen in all cancer cells, no matter what kind of cancer you have.
In a simple way of viewing that, is this correct that we're bombarded with electron donors
Exactly. NADH is
And
basically is what the was the in a proper metabolism, the body will use NADH as an electron donor later in the oxidative phosphorylation cycle to actually to generate ATP through the enzyme ATP synthase. So basically, the second, if assuming your glycolysis is working properly, your enzymes pyruvate dehydrogenase and pyruvate carboxylase are working properly, the pyruvate will get converted to acetyl CoA, go through the Krebs cycle, and eventually it will result into the generation of reduced coenzyme Q10 and also the reduced the NADH enzyme. So basically these carriers of electrons is what is used by the electron transport shuttles in the oxidative phosphorylation to actually get these electrons from NADH and give them to the terminal acceptor, which is oxygen. And in the process, NADH is recycled back to NAD. That is the correct way to maintain a high NAD to NADH ratio by getting the NADH produced at the very first step, which is glycolysis, shuttle it all the way through the Krebs cycle and all the 4 stages of oxidative phosphorylation, and at the very end, use oxygen as the final acceptor to properly oxidize NADH and convert it back into NAD. Recently, I think virtually every large research institution in the States and the Western world has realized that so far there has been no condition which has been studied for this purpose and has not been found that there is excessive glycolysis and excessive production of lactic acid with concomitant inhibition of oxidative phosphorylation.
so that inefficient metabolism causes an increase in the hormones and substances you talked about, like serotonin, prolactin, cortisol, and these just greatly interfere with digestion.
Depending on the test, of course, I think a lot of people are confused about exactly what kind of test to get. But if you're getting the basic metabolic panel,
what would you suggest? We talk about prolactin a lot. Obviously, that would be a good marker.
Yeah, I think prolactin is an excellent marker of health because it arises under both acute and chronic stress, and it's also a very good surrogate for the tissue activity of both estrogen and for your serotonin reserves. So in other words, by measuring prolactin, and it's been shown that the blood levels are reliable predictor of prolactin levels in tissues. By measuring prolactin, you will know exactly how estrogenic and serotonergic your entire body is. You can do I guess you can do a blood test for serotonin as well, but unless you have a carcinoid syndrome, which is probably the best example why the people who say serotonin is a happy hormone are full of it. Unless you have carcinoid syndrome, your blood serotonin will probably not be too high. But I think it's worth measuring it together with prolactin because it'll give you a better idea of where you stand.
I think Ray mentioned plasma serotonin. I've never seen anybody get that test done, but I think he mentioned that in the KMUD interview.
Yeah, it's more expensive. I think the typical test that's being done is whole blood serotonin, and he recommends plasma. And I've asked my doctor for it, and he refused. He said that the insurance will not cover it. Basically, the insurance companies spend a lot of money lobbying organizations to sort of to publish studies, so to speak, that try to establish good correlation between the cheap tests and whatever biomarker you're looking for. So whole blood serotonin is where it's at right now. But I think prolactin is a much better one, and it will tell you how much serotonin reserves you have both in your gut and in your brain. So prolactin is a good test. I think some tests for liver function are extremely helpful because one of the, if not the primary detoxifiant of endotoxin is the liver. That's why people with Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, IBS, basically diseases that are characterized by excessive production of endotoxin, they have abnormally high rate of liver disease as well, especially lately liver cancer. And one of the reasons is that, again, endotoxin triggers the production of serotonin in the gut. It's the primary trigger for production of serotonin in the gut, and serotonin is the primary agent of fibrosis everywhere in the body, but especially in the liver and the intestines. One of the biggest appeals of Ray's ideas, if you can even call them Ray's ideas, let's say one of the biggest appeals of the energetic ideas is that everything falls into place. Everything follows from other things. You don't have to necessarily look for isolated issues. Basically, you know that 2/3 of the T3 is produced in the liver, and you know that endotoxin is one of the primary poisons for the liver. So you will know immediately that people with conditions that tend to overproduce endotoxin will have liver issues, will have thyroid issues. In general, will be in poor health if bioenergetics is correct. And so far, based on the evidence we've seen, it has not been falsified even once. I have never met a person with Crohn's or ulcerative colitis disease that have not been extremely fatigued And recently, there have been 2 trials in Italy using thiamine, vitamin B1, only 600 milligrams a day of thiamine in both Crohn's and also the colitis disease patients restored their ability to exercise and to live a normal life. And again, the explanation was metabolism was restored. These people producing way too much lactic acid, which triggered all the other bad biomarkers like serotonin, endotoxin, prolactin, and estrogen.
But besides a trial of thyroid, you want to talk about caffeine a little bit? I've been really interested in all the studies you've been posting, and especially its effect on liver health.
Caffeine and vitamin K2 are probably the 2 best things for your liver that are found naturally. And the other 2 really good things that I know of are the amino acids taurine and glycine. There are many reasons, but one of the main ones is that taurine helps the liver detoxify itself. It triggers the production of bile acids and also makes the liver shed its fat into the bloodstream. So it gets the liver lean again. Glycine is the major inhibitory not neurotransmitter, but the glycine receptors in the brain, the spinal column, are the main inhibitory neurotransmitters. And if too much cellular excitation is what characterizes a lot of, if not all of these diseases, then an inhibitory amino acid like glycine is likely to be helpful. By the way, taurine, glycine, and beta-alanine are all analogs of the gamma-aminobutyric acid neurotransmitter, and that is the primary calming neurotransmitter in the brain. So they bind to the GABA receptor and agonize it. So they're all likely to have very similar pharmacological profiles and benefits as well. So caffeine is very similar in terms of function to thyroid hormone. It increases respiration. I saw a study recently that showed that as little as 50 milligrams, 50, as little as 50 milligrams taken with 20 grams of sucrose, with sugar, raised resting energy expenditure by 6%, and that increase was maintained for 12 hours. So it shows you don't need to do much to improve your metabolism, and the tools are already out there. They tend to be very cheap and easily accessible. It's just that there's a lot of propaganda against them. So to me, caffeine is actually a thyroid surrogate. It has been shown in animal studies and recently some human studies as well to lower the levels of TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone. It's a pituitary hormone, and when it's high, it means your thyroid is not working well. Your body thinks you need to produce more thyroid. So lowering TSH and raising the levels of T4 and T3, and these effects caffeine has, this basically is reminiscent of what taking a thyroid hormone will do. It does the same. Clearly, taking a T3 and T4 will raise the levels of those in the blood, but they also suppress TSH because it signals the body that you have extra hormone. It seems caffeine is able to achieve the same.
And you mentioned that your tolerance to caffeine could be a good metric of your liver health, which I thought was really brilliant.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's considered an official test for liver cirrhosis in several countries. I didn't know that. I knew about the hypothesis that the tolerance to caffeine can be used to sort of guesstimate how your liver function is. But believe it or not, I think in Norway, Venezuela, and several other countries, actually a specific dosage of caffeine is administered orally, and then certain parameters are monitored, such as the production of lactate, the production of adrenaline, the production of cortisol, and how quickly caffeine is excreted, how long its half-life is. In people with poor liver function, caffeine takes a long time to reach peak plasma concentrations because whenever ingested orally, it has a first pass through the liver. So it's the liver that decides how much to release in the bloodstream after first pass. And the second pass is the elimination. So basically, it has been shown that people with poor liver function, caffeine maintains a very long half-life. I know people who have proven poor liver condition through tests, and they know it, and basically. It's not a secret, and they have extremely poor tolerance to caffeine. They cannot drink coffee, and they've tried many things. They've tried combining caffeine with a benzodiazepine like Valium or Xanax, and it's still not working. It's not in their brain, it's in their liver. Liver function is what determines how well you will react to caffeine.
That was really interesting to me because I had a lot of younger friends, and I always noticed that they would drink coffee throughout the day, including nighttime, and never had any problems sleeping. And then a lot of my older friends, that would just be unthinkable. It would just keep them up all night.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, again, if you look at the bioenergetic explanation, it makes perfect sense. So if caffeine raises your metabolism, this means it also raises your need for nutrients. So if your cells are not properly capable of metabolizing glucose, in other words, if they have functional glucose deficiency, even though there may be hyperglycemia in the blood, that basically triggers the production of cortisol because the body thinks it doesn't have enough glucose. So that's how caffeine will raises the cortisol through ACTH system. Basically, caffeine, if the body perceives due to caffeine that it cannot meet the energetic demands of the increased metabolism, of course it will increase cortisol and adrenaline, because that's how it provides the extra nutrients from your muscles by destroying them and converting them into glucose, and from your fat tissue through lipolysis, which it gets oxidized through beta oxidation and then Krebs cycle and again oxidative phosphorylation. So if you don't react well to caffeine, you're probably hypothyroid and you have poor liver function. Caffeine is very dopaminergic. It has been shown that administering dopamine receptor antagonists to people who take caffeine blocks all of its effects. Even though caffeine does not directly bind to any of the so-called imaginary receptors that the pharma industry would like you believe exist, it has dopaminergic effects. And since dopamine is antagonistic to serotonin, because dopamine and dopamine agonists inhibit the enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase. So taking caffeine over chronically will tend to decrease your production of serotonin. And caffeine has also been known to directly inhibit some of the inflammatory mediators, specifically tumor necrosis factor alpha and NFKB, nuclear factor kappa B, I think is the full name. So caffeine does a lot of good things to the body, primarily by raising metabolism. But keep in mind that raised metabolism means you'll need to provide more resources for the body to be able to sustain it. And hypothyroid people and people with poor liver function, they fall into the same category, have trouble handling caffeine for those reasons: poor liver function and inability to provide sufficient glycogen for caffeine to do its good.
Cortisol, adrenaline, serotonin, prolactin, estrogen, they tend to make people feel not so good. What are some insights that you have? I know that I used to be a pretty much completely different person before I found a lot of Ray's work, and I couldn't explain a lot of the things I was feeling, and I really appreciate him because I feel like he let me understand myself better and my emotions and how I felt about things. And I know that even if I don't feel the way I want to, that I can do something to change the situation pretty quickly. And the substances you mentioned, like caffeine, we haven't talked about aspirin, but those things can really radically affect your mood, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was a study that I posted on the forum almost 2 years ago, I believe. It showed that it used an animal model, but it showed that aggression is primarily caused by lack of proper metabolism, by lack of oxidative phosphorylation. I don't know if they forced the animals to stay only in glycolysis or they just inhibited oxidative phosphorylation, but they said that improper metabolism turned the animals into raging beasts within a matter of minutes. And administering thyroid hormone, and they did use directly thyroid hormone, quickly reversed these effects. So that shows directly that proper mood cannot be maintained, just like anything else in the body, without proper generation of energy. And some of the primary inhibitors of this proper generation of energy are the endotoxin produced in your gut, and its associated I wouldn't call them cofactors, but they always tend to go together: serotonin, prolactin, estrogen, cortisol, adrenaline, and nitric oxide. So whenever one of these rises for whatever reason, it could be trauma, it could be stress, it could be improper food, and there are a lot of excipients in food, and we can talk about it if you want, that have been deemed okay to be included even in organic food. And I was shocked to find that carrageenan, which is a approved component in organic food in the United States, is actually banned in Europe as a non-carcinogen. I mean, I don't mean to bash on the States. Europe does a lot of things that are banned here, but apparently, just because it's known that, let's say, European Union, if it has like 600 million people believe, so to speak, that this thing is a carcinogen, should never be part of food, and then 300 million other people completely ignore that fact and happily ingest it. But anyways,
Just you're saying the FDA doesn't have our best interests in mind?
you have jokes. I think the FDA does what it can according to the environment, and you just keep in mind this is not something that's hidden information. I think 12 of the 15 members of the board that approved new drugs at the FDA, they're all former pharma executives. And by the way, guess what? The door is revolving, goes both ways. After they do a stint at FDA for a couple of 2-3 years, they go right back to maybe another pharmaceutical company for probably twice the salary. They stay there for a couple of years and then they go right back. So it's all this under the aegis of, well, I serve my interest, but I also serve the public's interest. and then it goes back and forth. But in reality, they only serve their own interests. So it's not in the FDA. There's nothing inherently wrong about an agency that tries to maintain safety and quality about food and drugs. The problem is when you allow that agency to be run by the very people that need to be regulated. I wouldn't. I mean, you'll be crazy to expect anything else.
I want to talk about staying happy in a sometimes sad world, but I also want for you to touch on antibiotics because this is similar to fructose malabsorption. It's like hugely controversial. And I know I was a skeptic until not only understanding that Ray's carrot salad was exerting a mild antibiotic effect, and I always warmed up after having the carrot salad and thought it was useful. But then using penicillin VK, I noticed a lot of positives about using that in addition to minocycline. So we're inundated with the idea that you should never take antibiotics, and do you think there's something wrong with that view?
Basically, if you are prescribed an antibiotic, I don't say often, but sometimes you'll be prescribed an antibiotic knowingly that it's being prescribed for less long than what is needed for its full effects to occur, because there is fear that it will decimate your so-called gut flora. So I don't know why people are so afraid of the gut flora. I mean, for example, babies are born with larger sterile guts, and I think we all agree that babies are the epitome of health, and their guts get colonized fairly quickly with bacteria from the outside world. And there are studies that show that most babies' serious conditions, even in baby age, happen after that colonization. It also it helps to keep in mind that over 90% of your serotonin is produced in the gut, and it only happens through the interaction of bacteria with the chromatin cells in the intestine. In the absence of bacteria, in the absence of colonic, or even worse, small intestine bacteria is much worse. It implies you're hypothyroid, or there's some kind of infection going on. Latent infection, or you're immunosuppressed. But bottom line is, the less bacteria you have in the colon, the less serotonin you will produce, and the less endotoxin you will produce. Endotoxin and serotonin being the primary poisons of metabolism, liver health, mental health, the proper functioning of organs, given that both serotonin and endotoxin contribute to fibrosis. So it shows you that it's probably good to keep your gut as sterile as possible. And believe it or not, there are studies, as I'm sure you already know about them, show that the things that act like antibiotics, such as activated charcoal and insoluble fiber including bamboo shoots and carrot salad, they've been shown to both decrease the bacterial count in the colon and thus decrease endotoxin, which can be measured through the levels of TNF-alpha in the blood, the levels of both endotoxin and serotonin. It shows you that keeping your gut flora in check is actually good for you. So taking antibiotics achieves that, and it has been even done in animals. Animals have had their guts completely sterile due to long-term administration of antibiotics. The same has been done in people inadvertently because they had conditions that required these long-term antibiotics, especially people with Lyme disease. I mean, if these people would go on a 6-month course of antibiotics, you will see how dramatic the improvement in health is. Even if the Lyme symptoms are still there, these people get dramatically better skin, better sleep, they have more energy. So it shows that the antibiotic is doing something, presuming it's only the bacteria, and we know it's not, but it's doing something by reducing the bacterial count, and it's making you healthier. So again, back to the alternative view, why would you ingest more bacteria if there is serious evidence that this bacteria is pathogenic, regardless of what species it comes from, whether it's Lactobacilli or some of the newer ones that are being promoted as treatment for IBS?
So in addition to the carrot salad or bamboo shoots, like some of the easiest things you could possibly do, vitamins A, D, E, and K, they have like a mild antibiotic-like effect. Do you think that's...
Vitamin K, basically, Ray talked about this in one of his shows. Vitamin K is pretty much the same molecule as the tetracycline family of antibiotics, and they include tetracycline, doxycycline, and minocycline, which we already took. So it's really the same. It's a type of quinone. So knowing that quinones are powerful stimulators of oxidative metabolism, then it's really not a surprise that these antibiotics and vitamin K work so well to improve your health. Not only they kill bacteria, but they stimulate the proper kind of metabolism. They also inhibit glycolysis, and that's probably one of the reasons behind their recent success in various human cancers. Just because it's an antibiotic doesn't mean it doesn't have other beneficial effects. And if you look at the molecule and you know how it works, you can deduce a lot of the effects of the molecule, even if modern medicine denies that they're there.
And not to mention, vitamin K would be good to take anytime you took antibiotics because the bacteria produces vitamin K.
Exactly. Yeah, I think vitamin K will be good because so a couple of things. It has been shown, by the way, recently that the conversion of K1, vitamin K1, which is the primary type of vitamin K that people ingest through food, it's called phyloquinone. You get it mostly from green leafy vegetables, especially kale and spinach. That's the major form that people get through their food, but it's not the active form, even though it's not the preferred form, even though it does have activity on its own. The body converts this into K4, menotetranol. It's a vitamin K2. I'm sorry, it's a vitamin K2, but there are several types of them, and one of them is vitamin K2 with four additional rings on the molecule, and it's known as menotetranol. So it has been shown, for a long time it was believed that it was the gut bacteria that was responsible for converting K1 into K2 type MK4. Recently it was shown that this conversion occurs in both people and animals with strictly sterile guts. But I'll still take that vitamin because it's one of the best things you can get over the counter to improve your metabolism and your health.
So in closing, Georgi's tips for a good digestive health in addition to keeping the mood balanced and not being susceptible to anxiety, annoying people, increasing your stress tolerance, basically.
Yeah, I think they go both ways. I mean, mood affects digestive function, and digestive function affects mood. But if you have to start with digestion and with food, what I would recommend doing is eating food that is as easily digestible as possible, with the exception, of course, of the carrot salad and the bamboo shoots and the charcoal. And I know a lot of people recommend eating resistant starch. That's probably the worst thing you can do. What you want to do is for food to absorb as early as possible. And by the time it reaches the colon, there is as little nutritional value in it left as possible, so that the bacteria that is there has almost nothing left to process, digest on, and produce endotoxin. So eat easily digestible foods. Milk is a very good food for even for that one reason alone. It's basically, I don't know of people that can produce endotoxin from milk. By the time it reaches the colon, it's almost fully metabolized. If you have to eat starch, which I strongly advise against, first because starch is extremely insulinogenic. It raises your insulin response a lot more than sugar does. Starch is basically pure glucose when it gets metabolized. So if you have to eat starch, make sure it's well cooked starch, preferably white rice. As shocking as it sounds, white bread if you have to even eat bread. I know Ray recommends against it because of the gluten. Potatoes, but very well cooked, because anytime you eat some kind of a carbohydrate, and starch is a type of carbohydrate, and if it's not well processed and if it's not well digested, it will feed your bacteria. In addition to the insulin response, you'll get an endotoxin response and a serotonin response. So eat easily digestible foods. Make sure most of the carbs, if possible, come from sugar and ripe fruits. Ripe fruits are preferable because they have the keto acids, exactly, which are precursors to protein. So keto acids are good. Maybe a little bit of digression here. The byproduct of protein metabolism when you eat protein is ammonia. Now, in healthy people, ammonia gets converted to urea through the activity of both the liver and it depends also on the levels of carbon dioxide in your blood. So in people with poor liver or kidney function, there's a buildup of ammonia, and it has been shown to actually happen in healthy people too. I think I mentioned in one of our last shows that there was a human trial with healthy, quote unquote, by the medical definition, people in Japan. They were middle-aged people in their 40s. They looked, they looked like just like any other person you would meet on the street, which of course doesn't mean they're healthy, but officially they were defined as such. And they were given an amino acid called ornithine, which is known to combine with ammonia and form urea. And these people, the very next day, they felt like they were 20 years younger. I mean, ammonia tends to accumulate in the brain and kills brain cells almost like no other substance except cortisol and glutamate. So the lower your ammonia, the better your overall health will be. Bipolar disorder is now considered to be caused primarily by ammonia. And one of lithium's main effects, and lithium is the main drug for bipolar disorder, one of lithium's main effects is is basically chelating ammonia, so to speak, and it makes you excrete it. So back to my original point. So it's extremely important to get a good amount of protein, because if you're not eating enough protein, your body will give it to itself by destroying your muscles. Your liver needs protein to function properly. So does your brain. If you don't get enough, the body will get it from your muscles. And instead of eating protein, if you have the ability to do so, one of the best things you can do besides protein is eat the keto acids that are present in potatoes, especially the potato juice. You can squeeze potato and get the juice minus the starch, but you can eat the potato too as well. Or ripe fruit. Ray mentioned this, and I've confirmed it by looking at studies, but leaves, vegetable leaves and ripe fruit have a very high content of these keto acids. So when you ingest these keto acids, they actually combine with the ammonia in the body, and everybody has excess ammonia. You can probably not have too little of it. So everybody has this extra ammonia, and the keto acids combine with it, and they form original amino acids, like the essential amino acids that you need for your body to function. So you're getting the best of both worlds. You're eating high quality food, which ends up endogenously producing the protein you need with virtually no waste material, at least as far as ammonia is concerned. So sufficient protein is very important. And if you have to eat fat, try to keep it as low as possible. I know some people get this fat crazed feeling when they eat low fat, but it has been shown that high fat diet, even if it is saturated fat, of course to a lot lesser degree than PUFA, but high fat diet directly stimulates the production of serotonin in the gut. So if you eat, and this is mostly due to the fact that whenever you eat fat, you secrete a lot of bile acids, which are necessary to process the fat. And bile acids have been shown to trigger serotonin production in the gut almost to the level that endotoxin would do. So try to eat low fat, and if you do eat fat, of course, always saturated fat, and worst case scenario, olive oil. Just avoid PUFA like the devil. There's nothing good about these fats, and the truth is already coming out.
Georgi, thank you so much for talking with me today. Where can we find more of your work on the internet this week?
You can visit the Ray Peat forum. The website is www.raypeatforum.com. My username there is Haidut, Haidut. I post many studies. You can search for my username in the search box, or just click on some of the studies on the front page. I usually have at least 3 or 4. So you can find me there by commenting on the studies, or you can send me a personal message to the forum, or you can send me an email. My email is haidut@gmail.com. And also you can visit the website of my supplements. I do manufacture, produce, and sell some supplements that are based on both Ray Peat's ideas and my own research. And the website for that is www.idealabsdc.com. Ideal Labs is one word. It's the way you hear it. IDEALABSDC.com.
Thank you so much, Georgi.
Thanks a lot for having me, and I look forward to our next show.
That's going to conclude this week's episode. I'd like to thank Georgi again for talking with me today, along with my patrons for their continued support of the show and all the content I produce. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. That was easily one of my favorite episodes, and Georgi's new mic was a direct result of user feedback, so pat yourselves on the back for making that happen. Next week, we're going to talk about nitric oxide and methylene blue, which should be a good show, and expect a bonus episode with Karen MCC later this week. Thank you so much for the support of the show. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button on YouTube. That always helps. And your comments are fully welcome too. So thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you guys soon.